Since 2015, League's midseason invitational has been the competitive scene's main counterpart to Worlds in showcasing high-level international competition between the best from each of the game's major competitive regions. And now with a full 10 years of history to look back on as we head into this year's MSI in 2025, now seemed like the perfect time to celebrate this decade of intense international competition by covering the biggest storylines and moments of each year, as this tournament has evolved from just a 4-day event into a now full-scale several round bracket to determine which 5 players will be crowned as the best team in the world. You see, back in the beginning of 2015, Riot announced that a new tournament would be joining League's competitive schedule that would be called the Midseason Invitational, being a small-scale event that was designed for players to get a taste of international competition leading up to Worlds, kind of like how the First Stand tournament is today. This first ever MSI competition was planned to be held in Tallahassee, Florida, and would be a 6-team tournament that took place over the course of 4 days between the regional winners from each of the game's 5 major regions, with the final slot being for the winner of a short wildcard tournament involving 7 teams from the scene's remaining minor regions, which was eventually won by Beşiktaş, a team from Turkey's TCL. When it came to the main tournament's formatting, back then MSI's structure didn't require a full-on dedicated video for explanation due to it being operated much more simply, as beginning with a group stage, teams would play each other 1 time each, with the top 4 teams from these matches advancing to a best-of-5 single elimination knockout stage, similar to how the previous year's All-Stars tournament worked. From there, the 1 and 4 seeds as well as the 2 and 3 seeds would face off against each other, with their respective winners going to the finals, where the winner of that series would of course be crowned the tournament's champion. Once again, pretty simple and straightforward. Now, for the tournament's group stage, unsurprisingly, we saw the teams representing the 2 minor regions get knocked out, in Beşiktaş and TSM being eliminated. But headed into the knockout stage, even though SKT had already beaten every team in the tournament in a perfect group stage, during their semifinals against Fnatic, they were unexpectedly taken to a full 5 games before eventually closing things out with a 3-2 victory, all while EDG swept AHQ in a swift 3-0. However, when you have a bot lane of eventual world champions Steph and Mako, this level of dominance should hardly come as much of a surprise, and thankfully for the fans, the finals would provide a much more exciting show. Though SKT would start things off strong in the first game of this series, EDG would strike back against the Korean champions by taking games 2 and 3 off this legendary lineup, only for strong performances by both Faker and Bang to send the series into one of the most legendary Game 5s in League history. You see, going into the final game of the tournament, Faker had never lost a professional game on his legendary LeBlanc, being 12-0 on the champion, with most teams throughout the tournament just banning it away when he was in the mid lane. And knowing that SKT would lock in the champion if it was open, EDG intentionally left her available and drafted a comp specifically to counter Faker, winning this Game 5 to hand the unkillable Demon King his first ever LeBlanc loss and lift League's first ever MSI trophy. Also, as a fun side note, not only did this year's tournament have matches between professional teams, but it also featured an exhibition match between some of League's biggest personalities, with caster team Demacia squaring off against pro player Noxus, where both teams could only pick champions from their respective regions. And despite this game being an absolute killfest that the pros unsurprisingly won, this would unfortunately be the only exhibition match in MSI history, as the following year didn't have one. However, to kind of make up for it, 2016's MSI group stage would instead double its number of games from 5 to 10, while otherwise keeping the same format. Though Tallahassee, Florida may have been humble beginnings for what was essentially MSI's trial run, the following year's tournament was hosted in the much more prestigious Shanghai, China, lasting 11 days as opposed to just 4 days from the year prior due to less venue constraints and the fact that viewers just wanted more games to be played. When it came to this improved group stage, one thing that may seem like a typo nowadays was that by the time both sets of the games have been played, North America's CLG actually placed second above T1 and only one game behind the group stage winners RNG, while the LMS's Flash Wolves continued their winning ways to secure the fourth and final slot headed into this next round. However, despite this strong showing, headed into the knockout stage, this Taiwanese team's impressive run was unfortunately cut short, as North America's CLG not only managed to beat them in both matches during the group stage, but they also ended up knocking the team out of the tournament entirely with a 3-1 victory in the semifinals. And while SKT had a surprisingly rocky start to the tournament by dropping 4 group stage matches in a row, they managed to continue their recently regained momentum of a 4-game win streak headed into their semifinals matchup against RNG, also defeating them in a 3-1 victory while securing their slot in the finals with a rare perfect game to really seal the deal. But while a perfect game against China's best was already impressive enough, things didn't seem to stop there for the Korean roster, as during the finals, SKT promptly smashed CLG in a clean sweep. And as an additional bit of trivia, 2016 SKT is the only team to have ever won both MSI and Worlds in the same year, even coming close to being the only team to achieve a full Grand Slam of titles, which they unfortunately missed out on due to not winning their regions following summer split. But though the event's second iteration didn't really change much about the tournament itself, 2017's Brazil MSI introduced what many of us League fans would come to recognize as the longest running format in the tournament's history, even if a much better one is used today. And before we run through these widespread format changes, one thing also worth mentioning in this 2017 tournament for both viewers and casual players alike was the introduction of a yearly Conqueror skin line. Though it hasn't been brought back for a while, from 2017 to 2021, each year a Conqueror skin was chosen for a champion that held a high presence throughout the prior year's World Championships, with 25% of the earnings from this skin sales contributing to MSI's overall prize pool. It was a unique, event-related skin that would unfortunately be swapped out to focus on making larger skin lines in later years. But anyways, returning to 2017's new MSI format, this year there'd be 13 teams invited to the tournament, with the play-in stage splitting the bottom 8 teams into 2 different pools based on their perceived strength. The winner from each pool's double round robin would play against either the LCS or LMS, with the top 3 of these 4 teams moving on to the group stage where there was only one group of 6 teams that functioned like years prior. Also, as a quick bit of added history from this play-in stage, the Gigabyte Marines' impressive showing against TSM during a very close qualification series would eventually help in gain the VCS its own regional slot for World's group stage, replacing a slot once reserved for the Southeast Asia League. Now, while this is a cool story for the VCS region, when it came time for MSI 2017's group stage, unfortunately for the Gigabyte Marines, things went pretty much as expected, with Korea and China comfortably sitting in first and second place. But as you can see, things were a little spicier towards the bottom, with a 3-way tie between 3rd, 4th, and 5th place, who were all competing for the only 2 slots remaining heading into the semifinals. Since G2 had a better head-to-head record against the Flash Wolves, they avoided having to play a tiebreaker match and secured their spot automatically, while TSM wasn't so lucky, and due to the team's questionable drafting throughout the course of the tournament, the LCS representatives were stomped out by the LMS champions, eliminating them from MSI and allowing the Flash Wolves to advance to the semifinals against SKT. However, while G2 managed to find redemption with a somewhat unexpected victory over China's WE in a decently competitive 3-1 series, the Flash Wolves weren't quite able to live up to their title of the Korean Killers, as the reigning MSI and world champions SKT would crush the squad's tournament hopes with a decisive 3-0 sweep, setting the stage for one of the first iterations of this now classic rivalry as SKT would face off against G2 in the finals. Though their victory over WE was definitely impressive, with a fitting scoreline of 3-1, SKT would once again cut off any talks of potential underdog victories for this G2 lineup, winning their 4th international title in a row and once again securing their seemingly untouchable reign over the league esports world. Well, that is until their loss in Worlds Finals later that year, followed by a 4th place finish in the 2018 Spring Split. And while they would obviously recover to chase MSI glory later on, for the first time in the organization's history, SKT wouldn't qualify for this midseason tournament, as Korea would instead be sending their back-to-back LCK champions, Kingzone Dragon X. Though Dragon X's entry to the tournament was a bit of a shakeup compared to previous years, one thing that remained largely the same for 2018's MSI was the tournament's formatting, only adding an additional team into the play-in stage this time around for a total of 14 teams in the tournament, which took place in both Berlin, Germany and Paris, France. Now, luckily for fans, 2018's group stage was far more even than the year prior, as the 6 teams were so close in the standings that instead of just one tiebreaker needing to be played, there would actually end up being 2, with one determining first place and the other determining which team was headed to the semifinals while their opponents would be going back home. While RNG would manage to secure their slot in first place above the LMS's best in the ever-dangerous Flash Wolves, the next chapter in a seemingly never-ending rivalry between EU and NA would prove to be a much closer bout, as the teams were much more evenly matched headed into this tiebreaker, with the hometown heroes of Fnatic ultimately claiming victory over their North American rivals Team Liquid, courtesy of a strong performance by both Caps and Reckless. But though it had been great to send their LCS counterparts on a flight back home, Fnatic's euphoria wouldn't last long past this series, as they would be swept out by RNG in the semifinals, while Kingzone Dragon X further solidified the dominance of the game's 2 most successful regions, taking out the Flash Wolves with a slightly more competitive scoreline of 3-1. As for the return of this Korea versus China finals, while Dragon X had the responsibility of bringing the region a 3rd trophy in a row, in an unfortunate twist of fate they would find themselves placed on the losing end of an ironic 3-1 scoreline themselves, as Uzi and RNG managed to finally bring back the MSI trophy home to China in a finals that would become one of the most viewed series in esports history, having 127 million unique viewers and over 2 billion hours of watch time. But even though the best teams of 2018's MSI were fun for the Eastern audience, at long last Western fans finally got their chance to the spotlight during the following year's tournament in 2019, this time taking place in Taiwan and Vietnam, with the number of participants being dialed back to 13, while basically everything else remained unchanged. When it came to the event's group stage, League's reigning world champions IG unsurprisingly dominated the field with an impressive record of 9-1, as not only did they claim victory in what is still the fastest game in international history, but they also maintained a perfect scoreline against every competing team in the tournament, with the only exception being one game against the 2nd place return of SKT. Although their performances weren't quite as solid compared to their Eastern opponents, both G2 and Team Liquid managed to lock down the remaining 2 slots for the West headed into the semifinals, where both Western representatives were faced with less than favorable matchups, as TL would face the nearly undefeated IG, while G2 would be squaring off against the most successful team in the game's history. But incredibly, not only did G2 manage to beat SKT 3-2 in a now legendary semifinal series, but even more impressively, the 4-6 Team Liquid beat the nearly undefeated reigning world champions IG in a 3-1 stunner, meaning that for the first time ever, a Western team would be guaranteed a victory at MSI. However, despite the immense amount of hype around this massive EU versus NA showdown, Team Liquid and G2 would face off in a series that would end up becoming the fastest international best of 5 ever, as G2 crushed Team Liquid in games that lasted 25, 28, and 18 minutes, for a combined total of a little over an hour of game time in an entire MSI final, redeeming this European roster with a well-earned victory after years of international defeat. Now, as you may recall, there was no MSI in 2020 as the world was still pretty locked down during May of that year, so instead of hosting the Invitational as originally planned, Riot decided to hold a mid-season streamathon for charities fighting against the virus, with different regions competing to raise these funds in different ways. As for the East, China and Korea would each send 4 teams to compete in a smaller 8-team tournament with an MSI-inspired format that would ultimately crown Top Esports as the overall winner, beating reigning world champions FunPlus Phoenix and claiming the mid-season cup. I know, Top Esports actually performing at an international event really shows how strange of a time this was. In a similar tournament with 4 teams instead of 8, the PCS and VCS combined their efforts into their own event, where Talon Esports took home the title over the Vietnamese organization Team Flash, who, if you are wondering, are not at all related to the previously mentioned Taiwanese team Flash Wolves. But while the East was using their freedom to run impromptu tournaments, the West was having a bit more fun with their time on stream, as Europe hosted matches with casters, personalities, and national teams, while North America held some exhibition matches of their own, running randomized teams in games that featured good times and some spicy picks such as Team Mode mid lane. Overall, these events were largely for fun and for the sake of charity, so while it was of course a bummer that MSI couldn't be held in 2020, this was a solid alternative. But once it was possible the following year to return to this mid-season tournament that we all know and love, international competition headed to Iceland with 11 teams, a new format, and no more plans. You see, with the exception of Vietnam due to travel restrictions, the 11 competing teams were divided into 3 groups, with the top 2 winners of each group making it through to the tournament's Rumble stage, where things returned to the MSI Classic of each team playing each other twice within a group of 6, and the top 4 teams advancing to the knockout stage just like years prior. Though it shouldn't really come as much of a surprise as to the teams that topped the pack during the group stage, some noteworthy moments included Pentanet GG winning their tiebreaker game to advance to the Rumble stage with a 2-6 record, as well as this now infamous moment of C9's jungler Blabber really wanting to make sure that he could secure his team the Scuttle Crab.
But being zoned out, he's gonna try, get stunned, take a bunch of damage, flashes to smite a Scuttle Crab, but Blabber, be careful, where is your team? He's at 200 HP! That is the worst Scuttle take I have ever seen in my life!
Now, when it came to the iconic MSI Rumble stage, unsurprisingly, the reigning world champions Damwon Kia finished at the top of the pack, followed by the LPL's best in RNG. However, in what is perhaps the biggest twist of the tournament, PSG Talon from the PCS League was the one to take the 3rd place slot of the group, with Europe's Mad Lions ending up 4th. Meaning that much to the disappointment of both the North American fan base as well as Cloud9's wallet, the LCS representatives would be making an unplanned early flight home due to a pretty underwhelming performance throughout the course of the tournament. With the top 4 teams now locked and advancing to the semifinals, while it wasn't much of a surprise that RNG ultimately won their series against PSG Talon, even if it did take 4 games, Damwon Kia's 5-game victory over the Mad Lions showed Europe that they didn't need G2 to perform on an international stage. But yeah, we'll talk about how that thought process turned out in just a little bit. As for the finals, despite entering into the tournament as League's reigning world champions, Korea's Damwon Kia would ultimately fall to China's RNG in 5 games, eventually setting up this Korean lineup to become the first of 3 teams to lose in the finals of both MSI and Worlds in the same year. Thankfully for the LCK, MSI 2022 would finally bring the tournament to their home turf, as the event took place in Busan, South Korea with 11 total teams. And while the VCS was thankfully able to make it this time around, unfortunately for Russia's LCL, they were unable to send a representative due to Riot placing indefinite sanctions on the region's league. The format remained the same as the previous years, with the teams divided once again into 3 groups, and the top 2 teams from each of these groups of course advancing to the 6-team Rumble stage. But what was especially notable was the dominance held by the first place teams in their respective groups, as each of the group stage leaders finished with undefeated records against their respective opponents, including RNG, who actually had to replay 3 of their matches due to ping issues occurring during these games. Though this group stage didn't exactly provide the most surprising outcome, at least the Rumble stage would conclude with a bit more of an evened out playing field, with reigning MSI champions RNG sitting atop the table rocking an 8-2 scoreline, followed by T1, and then both G2 and EG, who were tied for 3rd, each having a 5-5 record. Meaning despite the efforts of Saigon Buffalo and PSG Talon, unfortunately they were unable to make it any further, while in the semifinals the West would receive a rude awakening themselves as RNG swept EG and T1 swept out G2. But despite 2022's MSI being arguably the most predictable and stale in the tournament's history, at least it was closed out by a banger 5-game finals that held memorable moments featuring some of the game's biggest players, with RNG ultimately going back-to-back in the tournament to claim the organization's 3rd MSI trophy, while T1 would follow Dem1's path the previous year by once again coming in 2nd at both MSI and Worlds in 2022. Now, one of the major complaints about this year's tournament formatting was the lack of best of 5s for an international event, especially compared to the immense amount of best of 1s, where half the time the games just involved watching a major region team repeatedly beat down the same opponents over and over again. So to try and fix these problems, 2023's MSI saw the introduction of a new style of format for the tournament, one that featured many more best of series, double elimination, and the removal of group play as it had been in the past. By expanding the tournament to 13 teams in total, the event had now been split into 2 stages, starting first with the play-in stage, which had the second seeds from 3 of the 4 major regions, as well as all 5 representatives from the minor regions. These 8 teams would be put into a double elimination bracket against one another until only 3 teams remained, and from there, these winners would join the remaining 5 teams who had already qualified to the bracket stage, where together the 8 teams would play best of 5s with double elimination until a winner was ultimately decided and crowned champion. Despite outnumbering the major regions in the play-ins 5-3, unfortunately for the minor regions, none of their 5 teams managed to qualify for the main bracket stage. However, one cool thing for the LLA was that they found their first ever International Series victory by knocking Gwamm out of the tournament with a scoreline of 2-1, so hey, kudos to them. But while fans were excited for the drawing of international best of 5s, there was a small oversight in this new format that led to the tournament just turning into a bunch of regional rematches. With all the Eastern teams beating the Western representatives in the first round of matches with some borderline record pace, this meant that each of the 4 regions had their 2 teams in the same pools as one another. And due to an unlucky randomized draw, this led to each team being placed into matchups against the opponent that they already played during their own regular seasons, which for obvious reasons was disappointing to see in a cross-regional tournament. Unfortunately for the Western fans, even the cross-regional play was a bit rough to watch, as after G2 and Cloud9 eliminated their own regional counterparts, BLG and Gen G dropped into the lower bracket and eliminated the West entirely, with G2 being the only Western team to even take games off the East throughout the entire tournament. For the tournament's 4 remaining teams, it quickly became the LPL show, as while JEG managed to secure their spot in the finals by beating T1 in a banger 5-game series, BLG would make an impressive run through the lower bracket gauntlet, finishing off both Korean teams on their path to a rematch with their LPL rivals. However, despite an incredible run from being 5th place in the LPL all the way to beating Korea's best to advance to MSI finals, BLG was ultimately unable to seal the deal with a title of their own, as led by Knight's golden left hand, JDG finally claimed their first international title in the organization's history, and with one of the strongest rosters in League's recent memory, it was definitely deserved. Touching down in Chengdu, China for the tournament's most recent iteration of MSI in 2024, the format would be the same as the previous years, with a much needed change that would prevent teams of the same region from being drawn into facing off against one another. Thankfully, even if this rule wasn't put in place, things still would have been less problematic than last year, as during the play-in stage, despite 3 of the 4 major region teams moving on to the main event, PSG Talon exacted their revenge on FlyQuest by knocking the LCS second seed out of the tournament entirely and securing themselves a slot among the other 7 teams in the bracket stage, where they barely fell short of pulling off one of the biggest upsets in League's history by taking the LPL's number 1 seed BLG to all 5 games, something that G2 would replicate their narrow loss to T1 in a 5-game banger as well. While Gen G managed to clear their path to the finals through the winners bracket by sweeping Fnatic aside, followed by victories against both LPL teams, in the losers bracket, TL won the ever-heated NA versus EU matchup, while G2 brought a swift end to any hopes of a PSG Talon miracle run. Also, it's worth mentioning that a bit of a miracle run was beginning to form with Europe themselves, as while T1 finished North America's tournament hopes altogether in a bit of a rocky series, G2 unexpectedly shocked Top Esports in a 3-0 sweep of the LPL second seed, bringing with it a massive 2 days of hopium until T1 gave them a reality check with a sweep of their own. But unfortunately for these reigning world champions, this legendary T1 roster would have their own run similarly cut short by BLG, who were looking to make up for last year's runner-up finish in the tournament, beating the Korean squad in a close 3-2 series and booking themselves a ticket to the finals against the waiting giant of Gen G, who finally, after long being regarded as international chokers, managed to reclaim their throne by winning the series in a firm 3-1 victory, finally granting Chovy his first international title and for the first time in 7 years bring the MSI trophy back home to Korea, with the team looking to defend their recent title as we head into MSI 2025. So yeah, super excited for MSI this year, and I'm also making a couple MSI montages. I don't know if that will be out yet or not, depending on when this video releases, but if they're out, feel free to check them out, and if not, well, they'll be coming soon. But yeah, with that all being said, hope you guys have a great rest of your day or night, and as always, I'll catch you in the next video. Later!